Hello. This week's topic is education policy, so please read the assigned chapter before attempting the written question. But I wanted to give you a little bit of background on this topic. So education is one of the main responsibilities of state and local government. It has always been primarily a state issue, a state and local issue, so that every state has a Department of Education, and at the local level you have local boards of education that provide leadership to the public schools around the country. So again, education is one of the most important responsibilities of states. State constitutions address the importance of education. Certainly our state constitution here in Michigan mentions in a prominent way the public education system. Public education is funded by taxpayers in the states and at the local level. So state budgets provide money for public schools around the state, and then each local community has some way of paying for schools in that area. And each state has different rules and formulas for determining how public schools get their money. In Michigan, the sales tax that we pay on products here in the state is one of the major sources of revenue for public schools. So when you buy something in a store and you pay a sales tax on it, that a lot of that revenue is actually going to public schools in the state of Michigan. And then there is a formula by which the state distributes money to each of the public schools in our state. This was a result of a change back in the 1990s, which was designed to equalize funding across the state so that you wouldn't have wealthy school districts doing better than poorer school districts, that theoretically they were all supposed to get about the same amount of money, what's called the foundation grant. That has not been the case, unfortunately. There are still wide disparities between, say, urban and districts and suburban districts, but they do receive funding based on their student count. So those of you who went to public schools in this area probably remember when there was a count day. And the idea behind the count day was to determine how many students there were in that school, because that number determines how much that school gets from the state of Michigan for each pupil. So it's an important issue for public schools, and some schools have provided incentives for students to show up on count day so that they get the maximum amount of money they can get from the state. When a school is losing students, as happened in a lot of Detroit schools over recent years, then those schools are also losing funding from the state, since the funding is tied to the number of students in the school. Of course, what I'm describing is how we do it here in Michigan, but each state has its own way of providing money for schools. But I wanted to address some of the issues of policy and public education. So while the state and the local governments are primarily responsible for education, since the mid-1960s, the federal government in Washington has taken a very significant role in our public education system. There was a law passed in the mid-60s, around 1965, called the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the ESEA. This law was really the first major effort by the federal government to involve itself in education at the state and local level. And the idea was that the federal government was looking at issues related to poverty, how to combat poverty through changes to our healthcare system and through housing policy and other areas. But certainly education is a major component of dealing with poverty, because people who are poor oftentimes are going to very bad schools, poor schools as well. So the federal government said we can use our resources to try to improve these schools and improve the education for students who are struggling in poorer school districts. So almost every school district in the country receives some federal money through the federal grant program that was established in the 60s. And there are different ways that money is used, but the goal of it is to improve the education standards at the state and local level for students from every background, whether they're wealthy or they're poor or middle class. The program has generally been very popular. States like the money because it helps them expand their education programs. Some of it's also used for special education programs, and it's used in a lot of other ways as well. This federal money is also why school districts around the country must treat women and men or girls and boys equally in sports programs and in other programs they're offering. Because they're receiving federal money, the federal government requires that equality of both of the genders be included. So, with regard to federal money to schools, obviously, if the federal government's providing money to these schools, it expects something in return. The main thing it's looking for is that those schools are improving their standards, that the students are actually doing better. And of course, the focus is on students who are struggling, but the money goes to every school district almost in the country. So the standards aren't just for poor districts, it's for all districts. If a school district or a state is accepting the federal money, they have to comply with the standards. There was some controversy about 15 years ago when one of the versions of this law was renamed the No Child Left Behind Act, NCLB. This is something you may have heard about. It probably was in place when you were in school. And it was a law that really toughened the standards on local schools if they were accepting this federal money. It put a premium on testing, which a lot of education professionals thought was a bad idea because they said that we don't want teachers teaching to the test, and these high stakes tests put too much pressure on students. But from 2002 until 2015, the No Child Left Behind law was the law, federal law with regard to education, and school districts around the country were required to comply with it. Many people argue that it was not successful in a lot of ways because it put so much pressure on the local schools that they weren't educating, that they were just focusing on the testing, and that there were too many punishments in place for schools that did not do well, or even if just a few students didn't do well in the test, the entire school got punished, and a lot of people said that wasn't fair. In 2015, under President Obama, Republicans and Democrats came together to pass a new education law which replaced No Child Left Behind, and it's called the Every Student Succeeds Act, the ESSA. A lot of letters here. But the law was focused on reducing the number of tests that students have to take, but still continuing the focus on standards for students so that schools continue to focus on improving their student performance in the classroom and so forth. And so the law has just gone into effect over the last couple of years. So it's too soon to say whether it is a successful law or not, but certainly it has reduced the emphasis on testing and focused more on individual state strategies for improving standards. Now, the current president, Donald Trump, has appointed Betsy DeVos, who is from Michigan, to be the Secretary of Education. And there was some controversy in that appointment because Secretary DeVos has long been opposed to public schools in many ways and has focused on private and charter schools and religious parochial schools as alternatives to the public education system. We will continue to see what will happen with Secretary DeVos and anyone that might succeed her in that department. But certainly she was a very controversial choice for that department, and it was, I'm sure, part of President Trump's idea was to shake up the system. And again, we'll see what success there is with that. In the lecture that I provided online, I discuss some of the other policy ideas that have been discussed as ways to improve our education system. There's no denying that public education in the United States has been under stress for many years. American students are not performing as well as students in other countries on key measures of success, particularly in the areas of science and technology and math-related programs, which are where so many of the jobs of the future are located. But even in the areas of social sciences, such as this class, political science, which many of us chose non-science related fields to go into, American students don't do as well there, or in reading and math, reading and English classes. And so there have been different policy ideas implemented and tried around the country. Certainly, the standards movement, which was the focus of No Child Left Behind, was one idea. Another has been to focus on reducing the size of the classroom, the number of students in the classroom. Major teachers unions like the AFT, which is the American Federation of Teachers, and the NEA, the National Education Association, have focused on reducing class sizes, the argument being that if you have too many students in a classroom, it's harder for the teacher to really provide good instruction to students because of the need that they have for individualized instruction. and if you have too many students, it's just not possible to have that kind of instruction. There have also been focused on improving teacher prep programs at universities. So schools of education have come under attention. There's also been a recent focus on wraparound services. Certainly the teachers unions have focused on this as well. The idea being that many students come into school hungry or not having slept well the night before because of problems at home. So schools or struggling with transportation issues and getting to school. And so schools around the country and local governments have tried to figure out, can we improve things like nutrition at school so that students are at least get one good meal or 2 good meals a day at school to help them learn better. Maybe other alternatives to the transportation problems that they're facing. And even at the college level, we have things like the Hawk's Nest, which is here on campus, which is provides food and other items for students who may not have access to a lot of things at home. The idea being if you're well fed, if you're rested, if you can actually get to school, you're going to do better than if you don't have those opportunities. And so that's known as wraparound services, and some places have looked at that as a way to improve schools for the children and for the students. There's also the idea of school choice, which again is controversial in a lot of areas, but it would allow students to attend non-public schools possibly in their area, or other public schools or public school academies, which are called charter schools, all in an effort to provide some alternative to the public school. And so that is an issue, and that's certainly something that the current Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, is focused on. The problem that some people see with that is that it would only benefit a small number of people, and that if you want to benefit the vast majority of students, you really need to focus on the traditional public schools, which have the capacity to educate more students than the private schools. And the reality is that the vast majority of students are going to continue going to public schools, so that's where our efforts should be focused. So in any event, those are some issues I wanted to discuss with education policy. Please make sure you read through the online lecture, because I discuss a few other ideas, and then answer the written question for the week. And if you have any questions, please email me. Have a great week. Thanks.